Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. My name is Reed. Along with me, as always, is Mike. Mike, how are you doing, sir?
Hey everybody, I'm doing really good and I'm really excited about tonight because we're going to be talking about one of the all-time greats.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things we want to do on this channel, we always want to kind of be the positive voice for comics. Sometimes we'll always be honest and call out what we think is going wrong. But one of the things we love doing is just revisiting the classic creators who kind of made comics what they are, who gave us so many of these classic stories, these classic characters. Our first one that we did, we kind of wanted to do this monthly. So our last month, we did the first one, the King of Comics, Jack Kirby. But the second name that came up, and this was mainly, this is Mike's, maybe your favorite creator ever, was Carmine Infantino, a creator who does not get the credit that he deserves for his impact on the comic book industry. He's credited with some stuff, but I think Stan Lee and Jack, they get their name out there a lot and well deserved. But Infantino is humongously responsible for why we have the modern superhero and for the entire mythology. Mike, it kind of all starts with your boy Barry Allen and with the reboot he did. So when I say the name Carmine Infantino, Mike, what comes to mind for you?
Well, I was always a Flash fan when I was a kid and trying to dig up all those wonderful back issues from the 60s and Carmine was cranking them out. On the Marvel side, you had Jack and Stan, and on the DC side, you had Carmine and John Brome. And John Brome was writing scripts for Green Lantern and The Flash and several other things. Of course, Stan and Jack were doing their thing over at Marvel. But what's really incredible about Carmine is that he started as a teenager in the 1940s. This is him drawing, in All Flash Quarterly.
Oh,
Uh,
Jay Garrick, yeah.
yeah, drawing the old Flash. Like he was a teenager in the 40s working for DC Comics. Back then, everybody was happy, getting lots of work. Jack Kirby was over at, I think it was Comics at the time. And everyone was doing great. Then somewhere in the at the end of the 40s, the beginning of the 50s, comics kind of died out after the guys came home from war. They loved comics, but they wanted something different. And so the comics companies started putting out different things like war and horror comics. But one of the it was hard to get work as a comic book artist and a creator back then. And those horror and war comics were getting a lot of kickback from the very conservative American society at the time. And there was a huge backlash in the 50s. And you can actually see in this book, which is a great book about what happened to comics in the 50s. And we'll get back to how this all relates to Carmine. But the kids, they were burning comics.
Yeah.
A huge backlash. There was talk of them just being outright banned. And there's a famous story from Neil Adams, a very young Neil Adams, with his portfolio under his arm, going down to DC Comics to try to get a job in the late 50s. And he famously said, one of the guys told him, "Kid, your stuff's really great, but take my word for it, there's not going to be comic books in the next 2 years." The business was just going down. Sales were way down. People were burning comics. Congress was, trying to ban them. And the superhero was gone. What came in between? Some science fiction, romance, westerns, and then the Comics Code Authority was created to make them all nice and wholesome for conservative America, right? But here's an early Carmine Infantino, something that came out in the late 50s, early 60s, Mysteries in Space. A lot of that stuff was going on, and that's what sold. And Jack Kirby, Timely was almost out of business. Jack Kirby went over to work for DC during that time period. The one of the first times he worked for, well, no, that this would have been the second time. He worked for DC for three different times.
Yeah, the ultimate Marvel guy. Yeah, he had
Right.
multiple
And
stints
he
at
worked for,
DC.
yeah, he worked for DC three different times. So he was scurrying around looking for a job. It was hard to get a job. And legend has it, they were talking about bringing back superheroes sometime in 1955 or 1956. And nobody's really credited with who came up with the idea. But when they finally came up with the idea, they had Carmine draw it and they had Bob Kanigher write it. And DC used to do this thing called Showcase. And I don't have the original Showcase 4, but
Chris
this
Four.
is Showcase 14. This is the fourth appearance of the Flash. It's 1958. But somebody decided, hey, let's bring back a superhero, but let's make him look completely different. Carmine, design something exciting for the kids, maybe. And they changed his identity. They created Barry Allen. And these Showcase comics, there were four of them before Barry got his run. It was a tryout because you got to keep in mind at the time heroes were not selling. Captain
Yeah, you only
America
had a
got
few who were
canceled.
Batman and Superman were really the only two who kind
They
of hung on, and they were almost near cancellation.
Wonder Woman was appearing in Western themes to try and keep her sales afloat. Batman, they were throwing him in outer space, trying to keep his stuff afloat. Superman, they came up with this wild Superman family idea. They had Super Dog, they had Crypto. Suddenly his cousins appeared from Krypton, and they tried everything they could to keep those three, the holy trinity of comics, going, and it was a struggle. Sales were way, way down. But Carmine redrew the Flash and created this new character in this crazy looking modern suit. I mean, we take it for granted now, but this was a huge departure from the old golden age. I mean,
Yeah,
look at the difference. They made him sleek, they made him modern. This costume was the template for everything that was about to come. And it was Carmine Infantino. And these four comics that came out, it was Showcase 4, Showcase 8, Showcase 13, Showcase 14, sold phenomenally well. So DC took the next step. Let's give Flash his own comic book. But we're not going to make it monthly because we don't know. We're
yeah.
gambling here. But they put it out trepidatiously. And that's the first one. They numbered it 105. The last Flash comic from the 40s was number 104, because number ones didn't do good on the newsstand back in the newsstand wanted a comic that was tried and true before they bought a bunch of them to try and sell them.
So crazy how antithetical that is to now, where they keep
I know,
relaunching number ones all the time to get sales.
I
Absolutely.
know. So Flash's first comic of the Silver Age is numbered 105 to try. They were trying, you could see how desperate they were for sales. They didn't want to hurt their chances. But because Flash was so successful in 1959 with his run, all heck broke loose in the comic book world. They started putting out more heroes. They revamped Green Lantern. He was successful. They brought back the old Justice Society and renamed it the Justice League, where they had all their characters together. And because of Carmine revamping this character and being at the helm, so to speak, of recreating Silver Age characters, word got around to Marvel, and there was a golf game between Jack Leibowitz and Martin Goodman, the two publishers. One, Leibowitz was DC and Goodman was Marvel. And they played a round of golf together. And Leibowitz said, we got this great new book with a bunch of heroes in it, and it's selling like hotcakes. It's called the Justice League. And what do you think Martin Goodman did next?
Well, there you go. You get the whole Stan Lee Fantastic Four kickoff and all that after that.
Exactly. He goes to Stanley and says, hey, we need to do heroes again. Marvel was doing romance. They were doing Western. They were doing strange sci-fi, the Tales to Astonish, and all those crazy books that if you go back before the heroes, you didn't recognize what kind of comic it was.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, and the rest is history. But if it hadn't been for Carmine and the Flash, comics may have just fizzled out completely by 1961, 62, like the guy at DC Comics told Neil Adams that day. Son, your stuff's great, but there's not going to be comics in the next 2 years. You'll find something else to do, buddy.
No, it's
So
amazing how cyclical things are in terms of, how many times in the modern age do we hear comics are dead, comics are dying, comics are going to be gone. And it predates what's almost 70 years ago. You kind
right.
of have the same thing happening. I think the cool thing you mentioned, Infantino, what I've always loved when I go back and revisit a lot of his work is just, like you said, the radical reinvention of the Flash's costume. It's a lot different than Jay's. It's a lot more sleek, and it becomes what everybody kind of was chasing after that. And then it was a little more bold, a little more colorful, a little more outlandish. And it's so interesting to me in that it's the Flash's costume. There's been variations of it. They throw little lightning streaks in it and things like that at times, but largely it's exactly the same because he designed such a good costume that's kind of like you just don't really mess with it all that much
It
from
was the
his debut with
original
Barry.
spandex costume,
Yeah, it's
and no
really, really
cape,
cool.
no cape.
Yeah,
I mean, that
no,
was
no cape
radical.
and
Right?
creates that. I
Everybody
think the
had a
interesting
cape.
thing for Infantino too, you kind of go through his origins. It's the second act portion of that where he kind of becomes the editor of DC, and
Oh,
so many create he has part a hand in a lot of creations of classic characters. Black Canary and Batgirl, two of the still some of the most prominent female characters in
he
comics. He had
he
his hand in
created Black
creating.
Canary in the 40s.
Yeah. So you want to talk about two characters that have had longevity and have been in a world where female comic book characters, there's a lot of great ones, but some of the classic ones that have stayed throughout. It's interesting. He had his handprints on both of those. He brought in also a lot of talent to DC
Right.
Comics.
Because of this farewell issue.
Hmm.
It was 68. They retired him. Hold on, hold on. Oh, and we can't forget about how he created the
Also, yeah, the
multiverse.
multiverse, absolutely, in
Well,
123.
John Brome wrote the story. Okay, that's a
Hmm.
John Brome story. So he created the multiverse, but Carmine drew it. I mean,
Yeah, no, that you have his hand in creation in terms of so many, and I think that's the interesting with Flash is that Infantino's hands are on all of those issues early on. So many concepts that redefine the superhero genre, the reboot of it, the reinvention of it, the sleekness of the costumes, a lot with Brome, but also with him having his handprints on a lot of that.
how
Him as
about
editor,
the
he brings a ton of talent in.
how about the ultimate villain, a complete opposite,
Yeah,
right?
no, very, very, yeah, reverse Flash. Yeah,
Right.
no, and with so much of the Flash's world of current age is owed to Infantino. He then brings a ton of talent into DC, including bringing Jack Kirby back. So Kirby was a little dissatisfied with Marvel.
A
Infantino bring
little.
him in, and I think one of the cool things with Infantino when you hear Kirby is Infantino really kind of just said like, "Hey Jack, you're back, man. Do your thing." Like just and Jack's creativity got unleashed, and we get how many great characters from Kirby in terms of that entire fourth world and Kamandi and Darkseid, Mr. Miracle, Big Barda, all of that space stuff that really defines DC now kind of happens under Carmine and giving Jack what he needs.
The thing about it was when he kind of got retired and they put this farewell issue out. This was like the last Silver Age issue that he drew, which is an iconic. Look at that with the Rogues Gallery, all those characters he created with John Brome, and they made him editor and then later publisher. But he was the first artist to get promoted to an executive position. But because he'd been in the trenches since he was like 17, he knew the business inside and out. And he was like, we need to get new talent in here. He brought in Denny O'Neil. He brought in Neil Adams. He brought
Yep,
in all that whole group of guys, uh, Mike Kaluta,
yep,
um, all those guys that came out in the 70s. And then, of course, he courted, although it didn't take much convincing, he got the king of all comics, Jack Kirby, to come back to DC. And how did he do it? He said, just Jack, just do whatever you want. Maybe draw a little Superboy here and there for us, a few issues, and then the red will publish anything you put out.
No,
And
it's just brilliant decision making that they seem to have. And that, like a lot of this
yeah,
talent that you bring up, they're the reason a lot of those characters that were struggling with Batman and Superman got reinvented. You know, the Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams that he bring in so much of the modern Batman stories that we use as the basis for the Arkham games and for the movies and
and Green
for
Arrow.
animated series, Green Arrow, the reinvention of Oliver Queen. Yeah, I mean, you have so many things that he brought people in who made these changes that modernized the characters, and so the reason Batman is as popular as he is now. Infantino did drew some Batman pencils as well, like Batgirl creating her, but him having the vision to go, hey, as editor, let's put O'Neill and Adams, and the magic that happened out of that Batman run doesn't happen maybe if you don't have Carmine there to kind of go recognize the talent and put him there. And so much of the Ra's al Ghul, Talia, all those elements that have become so intrinsical to Batman, really Carmine's handprints are on those. He wasn't directly responsible, but he was the guy who petitioned that creative team to
He
go in
he
and do it.
was
So
he was steering the ship, and he knew what kind of crew he needed to keep the ship going. And he had gone through, some rough times with the comic industry. He was one of the few artists that got to keep a job during the 50s, whereas Jack Kirby, he was hustling,
yeah,
to going from place to place, trying to keep afloat. Carmine was one of the few that kept working. Him, along with Gil Kane and um, uh, Joe Kubert, of course.
yeah,
They all started, when they were teenagers, and they went through the business almost collapsing. So Carmine's forethought to kind of really go like, we're going to need to make some changes again to keep the ship afloat. Really just saved the day in the 70s as well. So like he reinvented superheroes. So he saved comics once there, and then he steered the
kind of
ship in the right
shepherds in the
direction.
modern age of
Yeah,
creators who took it to the next level.
twice.
Then you kind of have the cool third act portion of his career, and one that I knew him for before any of the Flash stuff, just as a young reader. One of the things for me as a kid, I always got a certain little budget to buy comics. And so I always ended up getting like $5. And that would typically get me three comics. And then I normally had enough for one discount comic. And so it was weird for me at my local comic shop when I was a kid in Broomfield, Colorado, the small town I lived in. They had a collection of kind of 50% off books. And so randomly, I just started collecting issues of Nova, with Richard Rider, the original one with Marv Wolfman. And I remember seeing a lot of pencils from Infantino. And I just thought that was, I totally just knew him from Nova as a kid to see here. And I know, Mike, you've got kind of the omnibus of Nova where we get some Infantino work well past his kind of retirement and heyday with that. You got him here
There he
drawing
is, and he
Iron
got to
Man and
draw.
Nova and stuff like that.
He got to draw Iron Man and Spider Man too in his late age. Isn't that cool?
Yeah, no, really cool. I was always so amazed when like I saw the name and then you kind of back then that was probably early 2000s internet, not really a huge thing in my daily life back then. And then revisiting Nova when I bought the omnibus, I'm like, oh yeah, Infantino. And then I remember being maybe 13, 14-year old seeing that, be like, holy cow, this guy like had a lot to do more than Nova. And so I was
Well,
I was kind of seeing like the later portion of his career that's probably forgettable for most folks. But it's really cool that he had a run at Marvel there at the end too. And I would definitely recommend if people haven't checked out the original Richard Rider Nova stuff. Just the storytelling from Wolfman's fantastic. But you do get to see some Carmine in there too, which is really cool.
he did come back and drew the last 20 issues of Flash before Flash got canceled. They did bring him back, and he drew for Carrie Bates, who was writing the stories. Carrie Bates, another amazing talent. Huge
Yeah,
stretch, 20 years. I think he worked on the Flash, or 15 years. Um, so yeah, Carmine. They did bring Carmine back to kind of close out the loop, and then Flash got killed
yeah.
in '85, and that was it. But he did come back and get to draw the last few Flash, so that was kind of cool.
really cool that Infantino did it. He hasn't gotten as much shot. I think I did always like the Flash TV series where they had, some cool thing. I think one of the main episodes in season three they had on Infantino straight, and they referenced his name a lot. And it was cool to see them get references for him in that. But definitely a name that does not get the credit he deserves in terms of his impact on overall comics. And that outside of Jack and Stan, there's a few others who've been there, but really in terms of the importance on saving the comic book industry, not the comic book industry, but the superhero specifically.
Yeah,
His influence on that cannot be overstated, and that he was absolutely vital to it. So much of and me and Mike as DC fans, so much of DC Comics now is in the hands of what Carmine Infantino did. Without him there to help some of those other great creators kind of shape it, and obviously the John Bromes and everybody else, they obviously get their credit as well. But really seems like Infantino was a huge, major force that kept kind of implementing these changes and ideas and shepherding talent in there, and it's just we're really thankful for his impact and his influence for what he did with comics. Wanted to make sure as we go through this series and kind of honor the great creators of the past that we got called out and gave Infantino his credit. And I know from Mike, this was a big one for you as a Flash fan, that this is the guy who gave you your favorite superhero. So as
absolutely.
always, we appreciate everybody watches. Let us know what you think below. What did you know all this about Carmine Infantino? What's your favorite Carmine Infantino work if you have seen some of his work? And if you haven't checked out Carmine's stuff, please go back and read some of these old flashes. They do fantastic facsimile reprints of a lot of his issues. And definitely check out his Novo work as well. That's a weird recommendation, I think, for people on Carmine, but I will personally say I absolutely love his Novo work. Let us know, as always, what you think below. If you enjoy our content, make sure you like and subscribe. And if there's a creator you would like to see us cover, please put that in the comments as well. We got a couple we're going to go through. We want to make sure we give the legends of this industry their due on this channel, and bring attention to those. As always, we thank you for watching, and we will catch you in our next video.
Thanks, everybody.